His vows were her chains. Livia Marchesi had once been royalty, a princess in a kingdom of blood. But when her father's empire fell overnight, she learned a brutal truth: without power, she was nothing. And now he had found her. Rafael Costa smirked, his fingers tracing her jaw. "You thought you could disappear?" he murmured. "That was adorable." Chapter 1. The Ghost of Via Monte Napoleon. The rain was a relentless curtain, blurring the elegant storefronts of Via Monte Napoleon. Milan, even in its gloomiest hours, held a certain theatrical grandeur. Livia Marchesi, however, felt none of it. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that no longer existed, her once bespoke cashmere coat now a shield against more than just the weather. It hid the tremor in her hands, the constant, gnawing fear that had become her unwelcome companion. 5 years. 5 years since the night her world had imploded. 5 years since the name Marchesi, once whispered with reverence and fear, had become synonymous with disgrace and ruin. Her father, Antonio Marchesi, the capo of the most formidable family in Milan, had fallen. Not to a rival family, not to the authorities, but to something far more insidious: betrayal from within. The details were murky, a swirling vortex of accusations and whispered rumors, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. Their empire, built on generations of blood and loyalty, had crumbled overnight. Livia had fled, shedding her identity like a snake shedding its skin. She'd become Olivia Miller, a quiet, unassuming American translator, blending into the tapestry of Milanese life. She'd chosen the city, this street even, as a form of self-inflicted penance, a constant reminder of what she had lost, of the gilded cage she had once inhabited. She worked from home, translating documents, her world shrunk to the confines of a small, sparsely furnished apartment overlooking a quiet courtyard. Her only indulgence was a daily walk, a ritual that both comforted and tormented her. Today, the rain was particularly heavy, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. She'd received a letter that morning, a crisp, white envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper bearing a stark, chilling message: "They know." Who they were, she didn't know. But the implication was clear. Her carefully constructed anonymity was cracking. The past, like a persistent tide, was threatening to pull her under. She stopped in front of a darkened boutique, its window displaying a single, exquisitely crafted leather handbag. It was the kind of accessory she wouldn't have given a second glance to 5 years ago. Now, it represented an unattainable luxury, a symbol of a life that felt like a distant dream. She stared at her reflection in the rain-streaked glass, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The vibrant, confident Livia Marchesi was gone, replaced by a woman etched with weariness and a bone-deep sadness. Her dark hair, once meticulously styled, was pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, once sparkling with mischief and defiance, were shadowed with a perpetual vigilance. A shiver ran down her spine, a prickling sensation that had nothing to do with the cold. She was being watched. She could feel it, a palpable presence at the edge of her awareness. She'd learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of her family's world. Even stripped of her power, that primal awareness remained. She forced herself to move, her pace quickening, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned a corner, seeking the relative anonymity of a narrower, less trafficked street. The feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each step. A figure emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. Tall, imposing, with a presence that radiated both power and a chilling calm. He was dressed impeccably, a dark suit that seemed to absorb the surrounding gloom, his face partially obscured by the shadows of a fedora. But Livia didn't need to see his face clearly to know who he was. She'd known, on some instinctual level, that this moment was inevitable. Raffaele Costa. Her father's enforcer. The man who had been both his shadow and his sword. The man who, according to the whispers, had been instrumental in her father's downfall. He was the last person she ever wanted to see, a living embodiment of her loss and betrayal. And yet, a part of her, a buried, almost forgotten part, felt a flicker of something else. Something akin to relief. He moved closer, the scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, something dangerous, filling the air around her. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his gaze. His eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, held hers captive. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held secrets she couldn't even begin to fathom. "Livia," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver of both fear and something else, something unsettlingly familiar, through her. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an acknowledgement of a truth that had been buried, but never truly extinguished. She tried to speak, to deny it, to maintain the facade she had so painstakingly constructed, but the words died in her throat. She could only stare at him, her breath caught in her chest. He smirked, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that sent a jolt of fear through her. His fingers, long and elegant, reached out and traced the line of her jaw, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. The contrast was jarring, unsettling. "You thought you could disappear?" he murmured, his voice a silken whisper that seemed to wrap around her like a velvet shroud. That was adorable. The word, spoken with such mocking tenderness, was a cruel reminder of her naivety, of her desperate attempt to escape a past that was inextricably woven into the fabric of her being. She finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "What do you want?" He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I want what's mine," he said, his voice a low growl that sent a tremor through her. "And you, Principessa, are mine." The world tilted. The carefully constructed walls she had built around herself crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She was no longer Olivia Miller, the anonymous translator. She was Livia Marchesi, the fallen heiress, and she was once again caught in the web of her family's legacy. A legacy of power, betrayal, and a darkness that she could no longer escape. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life, as she had known it, was over, and a new, far more dangerous chapter was about to begin. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of her former life, leaving her standing in the cold, unforgiving present, facing the man who held her fate in his hands. He gave a slight, knowing smile, but the promise held in it, and the threat, were equal. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Shattered Crown. The small, nondescript trattoria was Livia's sanctuary. Tucked away on a side street near the Duomo, it was a place where she could blend in, become just another face in the bustling crowd. The aroma of simmering tomatoes, garlic, and basil hung heavy in the air, a comforting blanket against the chill that had settled deep in her bones after her encounter with Raphael. She'd managed to evade him, slipping away into the labyrinthine streets of Milan, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. She knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Raphael Costa was not a man easily deterred. He was relentless, a predator who had scented his prey and wouldn't rest until he had her cornered. The owner, a stout, jovial woman named Signora Rossi, greeted her with a warm smile. "Olivia. Cara, you look like you've seen a ghost." Livia forced a smile in return. "Just a bit tired, Signora Rossi. The rain, you know." Seat. "I'll make you something special. Zuppa di fagioli, to warm you up." Livia gratefully sank into a chair at her usual table, a small, secluded corner near the back of the restaurant. She watched as Signora Rossi bustled around the kitchen, her movements practiced and efficient. The clatter of pots and pans, the sizzle of olive oil, the murmur of conversations in Italian, it was all a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. But even here, surrounded by the comforting normalcy of everyday life, she couldn't escape the shadow of Raphael Costa. His words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of her precarious situation. "I want what's mine. And you, Principessa, are mine." The possessiveness in his voice, the way he'd looked at her, as if she were a possession to be reclaimed, had sent a shiver of both fear and a strange, unsettling excitement through her. It was a dangerous combination, one she knew she couldn't afford to indulge. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image of her father, Antonio Marchesi. He'd been a formidable man, a force of nature. He'd ruled his empire with an iron fist, but he'd also possessed a charisma, a charm that could disarm even his most hardened enemies. He'd loved Livia fiercely, protectively, grooming her to be his heir, to take her place in the family business. She'd been his princess, his principessa, and he'd taught her everything he knew. About power, about loyalty, about survival. But he hadn't taught her how to survive without him. He hadn't prepared her for the possibility of betrayal, of losing everything. A steaming bowl of zuppa di fagioli appeared before her, the rich aroma momentarily distracting her from her thoughts. Signora Rossi placed a basket of crusty bread beside it.
Eat, gotta.
You need your strength. Livia picked up her spoon, the simple act of eating a grounding force. The soup was delicious, hearty and flavorful, a taste of home, of comfort. But even as she ate, her mind raced. She needed a plan. She couldn't simply run again. Raphael would find her. She needed to understand what he wanted, why he had come looking for her after all these years. Was it simply revenge? Or was there something more? The letter. They know.
Who were they?
And what did they know? Did it have something to do with her father's downfall? Was Raphael involved? She finished her soup, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. She paid Signora Rossi, offering a genuine smile this time, a flicker of gratitude for the small act of kindness. As she stepped back out into the rain, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She might be a fallen heiress, but she was still a Marchesi. She had survived this long. She would not be intimidated. She would not be controlled. She would find out the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness that had haunted her for the past 5 years. She walked towards her apartment, her steps purposeful, her head held high. She was no longer running. She was searching. She was reclaiming her life, piece by piece. She reached her building, a faded but elegant structure that had seen better days. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows, partially hidden by the overgrown ivy that climbed the walls. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Raphael. This man was older, his face lined with years of hard living, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. He wore a worn, but impeccably tailored, suit, the kind of suit that spoke of old money, of a faded aristocracy. He stepped forward, his gaze meeting hers. "Signorina Marchesi," he said, his voice raspy, but his tone respectful. "My name is Alessandro Bellini. I was a friend of your father's." Livia stared at him, her mind racing. Bellini. The name was vaguely familiar, a whisper from her past. She remembered her father mentioning him once, a long time ago. He had been a trusted advisor, a confidant, before everything had fallen apart. What was he doing here? And did this have something to do with the ominous note? The fear began to twist again, but now there was a flicker of something else: anticipation. Chapter 3. The Serpent's Gaze. Alessandro Bellini's apartment was a reflection of the man himself. Faded elegance, a whisper of past grandeur clinging to the edges of a present defined by quiet solitude. It was located in a historic palazzo, the kind of building that held centuries of secrets within its walls. The air was thick with the scent of old books, beeswax, and a faint trace of pipe tobacco. Livia sat stiffly on a velvet-covered armchair, its fabric worn thin in places, mirroring the threadbare state of Bellini's fortunes. He had insisted she call him Alessandro, a gesture of familiarity that both comforted and unsettled her. He poured them both a glass of amber liquid, Amaro, its bitter-sweet taste a fitting accompaniment to the conversation that was about to unfold. "Your father," Alessandro began, his voice a low rumble, "was a complex man, loyal to a fault, but also blinded by that loyalty." Livia nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in her glass. She knew this to be true. Her father's unwavering faith in his inner circle had ultimately been his undoing. He trusted the wrong people, Alessandro continued, his gaze distant, lost in the memories of a bygone era. He believed in the code, in the sanctity of Omerta. But the code has been corrupted, twisted by greed, by ambition. Omerta, the code of silence, the bedrock of the mafia's existence. It was a code Livia had grown up with, a code she had once believed in implicitly. Now, it felt like a suffocating shroud, a symbol of the lies and betrayals that had shattered her world. The letter, Livia said, her voice barely a whisper. What does it mean? Alessandro sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. It means that those who betrayed your father are aware of your resurfacing. They know you are alive, and they fear what you might know. But I don't know anything, Livia protested, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. I was kept in the dark. My father, he shielded me from the uglier aspects of the business.
Alessandro smiled sadly.
Perhaps. But they don't know that. And perception, Signorina, is often more powerful than reality. He took a sip of his Amaro, his gaze meeting hers. There were rumors, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Rumors of a ledger. A record of your father's transactions. A list of names, of debts, of secrets. Livia's heart skipped a beat. A ledger. It was the stuff of mafia legends. A physical manifestation of power, of control. If such a thing existed, it would be invaluable, both to those who wanted to claim her father's mantle and to those who wanted to bury his legacy forever. My father never mentioned a ledger, Livia said, but even as she spoke the words, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She remembered a small, locked safe in her father's study, a safe she had never seen opened. Could it have contained such a thing? He wouldn't have, Alessandro said, his voice firm. Not to you. Not to anyone he didn't trust implicitly. And you think this ledger exists?
Alessandro nodded slowly.
I believe so. And I believe Rafael Costa knows where it is. Rafael. His name, spoken aloud, sent a shiver down Livia's spine. The enforcer. The betrayer.
Or was he?
Alessandro's words had planted a seed of doubt, a glimmer of uncertainty in the narrative she had clung to for the past 5 years. Why are you telling me this? Livia asked, her gaze searching Alessandro's face. What do you want? He smiled, a melancholic expression that spoke of lost hopes and faded dreams. I want justice, he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. For your father. For what we lost. And perhaps for myself. He stood up, walking over to a window overlooking the rain-swept courtyard. Rafael is a dangerous man, Signorina. But he is also a creature of habit. He operates within a certain code. A code that can be exploited. He turned back to face her, his eyes filled with a steely determination. I can help you, he said. I can help you find the ledger. And I can help you use it to reclaim what is rightfully yours. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. It was a dangerous proposition, a gamble that could cost her everything. But it was also a chance to uncover the truth, to avenge her father, to reclaim her identity. She looked into his aged, world-weary eyes. A flicker of something she hadn't felt in 5 years stirred in her. Not trust, not yet, but a burgeoning hope, a slender tendril reaching for the light. What do I have to do? She asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. Alessandro's response was simple, yet terrifying. You have to trust me, and you need to get close to Rafael Costa. He paused. Very close. The words lingered in the air, a serpentine promise of danger and potential reward. The very thought was enough to both frighten her and invigorate a long-dormant part of her spirit. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Palazzo Ruins. The Palazzo Visconti was a ghost of its former glory. Once a symbol of Milanese power and opulence, it now stood in a state of elegant decay, a crumbling testament to the fleeting nature of fortunes. It was here, amidst the ruins of a bygone era, that Rafael Costa had chosen to establish his base of operations. A fitting location, Livia thought, for a man who thrived in the shadows. Alessandro had provided her with the address, along with a cryptic warning. Be careful, signorina. The walls have ears. And Raphael, he has eyes everywhere. She'd approached the palazzo with a mixture of trepidation and determination. She'd traded her unassuming attire for a dress that was both elegant and understated, a dark, flowing garment that hugged her curves without being overtly provocative. She needed to project an image of confidence, of strength, even if she felt anything but. The entrance was guarded by two men, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning her with a chilling scrutiny. They were dressed in dark suits, their presence a stark reminder of the world she was stepping back into. I am here to see Signor Costa, Livia said, her voice steady, betraying none of the nervousness she felt. She used her real name, a deliberate choice, a signal that she was no longer hiding. One of the men spoke into a walkie-talkie, his words clipped and unintelligible. After a brief pause, he nodded. He is expecting you. They led her through a series of dimly lit corridors, the air thick with a scent of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic, something that reminded her of blood. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes, depicting scenes of mythological battles and courtly love, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the palazzo's current inhabitants. They finally reached a large, ornate door, its wood intricately carved with scenes of hunting and feasting. One of the guards knocked, a sharp, percussive sound that echoed through the silence. A voice from within, low and resonant, commanded, enter. Livia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was vast, a cavernous space that had once been a ballroom. Now, it served as Raphael's office, a strange juxtaposition of grandeur and menace. The high ceilings were adorned with elaborate chandeliers, their crystals casting flickering shadows on the walls. The floor was covered with a Persian rug, its intricate patterns faded and worn. Raphael was standing by a large window, overlooking a neglected courtyard. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture relaxed, but his presence radiating an undeniable power. He turned as she entered, his eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, fixing on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't speak for a moment, simply studying her, his gaze taking in every detail of her appearance. It was a predatory gaze, assessing, evaluating, but there was also something else, a flicker of something that might have been admiration. Livia, he said, his voice a low murmur.
You came.
It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the inevitable. You knew I would, Livia replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips. Of course. You're your father's daughter, after all. The words were a challenge, a subtle reminder of her heritage, of the legacy she had both inherited and tried to escape. What do you want, Raphael? Livia asked, cutting to the chase. She didn't have time for games. She needed answers. He moved away from the window, walking towards her with a slow, deliberate grace. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, to smell the subtle scent of his cologne. I told you, he said, his voice a low growl. I want what's mine. And what is that? Livia asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. You, he said, his voice a silken whisper. And everything that comes with you. Livia knew what he meant. The legacy, the power, the secrets. But there was something else in his eyes, something that went beyond mere ambition. It was a hunger, a desire, that both frightened and intrigued her. I am not a possession, Raphael, Livia said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine.
No, he said.
You're not. You're a queen. A fallen queen. But a queen nonetheless. He paused, his gaze searching hers. And I, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, intend to help you reclaim your throne." His words were a siren song, a promise of power and redemption. But Livia knew that the path to reclaiming her throne would be paved with danger, with betrayal, with secrets that could destroy them both. She met his intense stare, and with a new clarity of purpose, knew she was about to enter a world of shadows that might consume her. She sensed, with the instincts of a Marchese, that her life, intertwined with Raphael's, was now bound by an unspoken pact. And the whispers in the palazzo ruins were only the beginning. The anticipation coiled tight, and a strange excitement pulsed beneath her fear. Chapter 5. A bargain struck in darkness. The air in Raphael's office, thick with unspoken tension, crackled with a dangerous energy. Livia stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by his proximity, by the raw power that emanated from him. "Reclaim my throne?" she repeated, her voice laced with a skepticism she didn't entirely feel. "And what makes you think I want that?" Raphael smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because, Principessa, it's in your blood. You were born to rule. You may have run from it, but you can't escape it." He moved closer, his presence overwhelming, his scent, a mix of sandalwood and something darker, filling her senses. "Besides," he added, his voice a low murmur, "you need me." Livia bristled at his words. "I need you? I've survived perfectly well without you for the past 5 years. Survived, yes," Raphael conceded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the subtle signs of her carefully constructed anonymity, the worn elegance of her dress, the haunted look in her eyes. "But have you lived?" The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the emptiness that had defined her existence since her father's fall. She had existed, yes, but she hadn't truly lived. She'd been a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that no longer existed. "What do you propose, Raphael?" Livia asked, her voice tight with a mixture of apprehension and a flicker of something else, something akin to anticipation. He gestured towards a pair of ornate chairs placed before a massive fireplace, its embers glowing a dull red. "Let's talk," he said. They sat, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. Raphael poured them both a glass of grappa, its potent aroma filling the air. "Your father," Raphael began, his voice losing some of its usual edge, replaced by a tone that was almost reflective, "made mistakes. He trusted the wrong people." Livia nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in her glass. It was a truth she had already come to accept, a bitter pill she had swallowed long ago. "But he also had assets," Raphael continued, his gaze meeting hers. "Assets that were misappropriated. Assets that rightfully belong to you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I can help you recover those assets," he said. "I can help you rebuild what was lost."
"And in return?"
Livia asked, her voice wary. She knew there would be a price. There was always a price. Raphael smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face from one of cold calculation to something almost approachable. "Loyalty," he said, his voice firm. "Your loyalty. And your cooperation." Livia studied him, trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind his words. Loyalty. Cooperation. What did he really want? And what does that cooperation entail? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, his presence filling the space between them. "Information," he said. "Access."
"Trust."
He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "There are things I need to know, Livia. Things only you can tell me. Things about your father, about his business, about the ledger." The ledger. Alessandro Bellini's words echoed in her mind. Raphael knew about the ledger. Or, at least, he believed it existed. "And if I refuse?" Livia asked, her voice a challenge. Raphael's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then you go back to your anonymous existence," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "And you continue to live in fear, wondering when those who betrayed your father will come for you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Or," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, Worse, they might already be here. He made a show of looking around the expansive room, a clear and theatrical taunt. It was a threat, veiled but unmistakable. He was offering her a choice, a bargain struck in darkness. Protection, power, redemption in exchange for her loyalty, her cooperation, her trust. Livia weighed her options, her mind racing. She could refuse, walk away, and try to disappear again. But she knew that wouldn't be enough. She was tired of running, tired of hiding. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And a part of her, a part she had tried to suppress, wanted to reclaim her birthright. She took a deep breath, her decision made. "I accept," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "But on my terms." Raphael raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "And what are those terms, Principessa?" "Full transparency," Livia said. "No more secrets. No more games. I want to know everything. About my father, about the ledger, about you." He leaned back in his chair, studying her, a hint of respect in his gaze. "A demanding queen," he murmured. "I like that." He extended his hand, his palm open. A gesture of what? Alliance? Partnership? Or something more? Livia hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back. She placed her hand in his, her skin tingling at the contact. His grip was firm, strong, possessive. "It's a deal," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement through her. A bargain had been struck. A dangerous alliance had been formed. And Livia knew that she had just stepped onto a path that would lead her either to salvation or to ruin. The darkness around them seemed to deepen, but in Raphael's eyes, she saw a spark, a reflection of her own, newly ignited flame. She couldn't tell if it was a promise or a threat, but she was ready to find out. Chapter 6. The Weight of Unseen Chains. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings, whispered conversations, and a growing sense of unease. Livia found herself drawn into Raphael's world, a world of shadows and secrets, of shifting alliances and hidden agendas. He had moved her into the Palazzo Visconti, ostensibly for her protection, but Livia knew it was also a way to keep her close, to control her. She had a suite of rooms on the upper floor, a gilded cage that offered both luxury and confinement. The rooms were opulent, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and a lingering sense of the palazzo's past inhabitants. But they were also isolated, far from the bustling activity of the city, a constant reminder of her precarious situation. She spent her days poring over old documents, letters, and financial records, searching for any clue that might lead her to the mythical ledger. Alessandro Bellini had provided her with a starting point, a list of names, of businesses, of properties that had once belonged to her father. It was a daunting task, like trying to piece together a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a distorted image of the past. Raphael was a constant presence, a shadow that followed her every move. He was both her protector and her captor, her confidant and her interrogator. He would question her relentlessly, probing her memories, searching for any detail, no matter how insignificant, that might shed light on her father's secrets. Their conversations were a delicate dance, a constant push and pull of trust and suspicion. Livia was careful about what she revealed, aware that every word, every gesture, could be used against her. She was playing a dangerous game, and she knew that one wrong move could have devastating consequences. But she was also learning about Raphael, about his motivations, about the complex web of relationships that bound him to her father's legacy. She discovered that he was not simply a ruthless enforcer, as she had initially believed. He was a man of contradictions, capable of both brutality and unexpected tenderness. He had a code, a set of rules that he lived by, a code that was rooted in loyalty and honor, but also in a pragmatic understanding of the world he inhabited. He was a survivor, a man who had risen through the ranks of the mafia through a combination of intelligence, cunning, and a willingness to do whatever it took to protect his interests. He spoke of her father with a mixture of respect and resentment, acknowledging his power and charisma, but also his flaws, his blindness to the betrayal that had ultimately led to his downfall. "Your father was a great man," Raphael said one evening as they sat in his office, sharing a bottle of wine. "But he was too trusting. He believed in the old ways, in the sanctity of Omerta. But the world has changed, Livia. The code has been broken." Livia nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. She knew this to be true. The world she had grown up in, the world of unwavering loyalty and unbreakable bonds, no longer existed. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Do you believe in the code?" Raphael smiled, a cynical expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe in survival," he said. "And sometimes survival means bending the rules." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But there are some lines I will not cross," he added, his voice firm. "Some loyalties I will not betray." Livia wondered if he was referring to her father, or to someone else, or perhaps to her. The unspoken question hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the complex relationship that was developing between them. They were bound together by a shared past, by a common goal, but also by a growing attraction, a dangerous undercurrent that threatened to consume them both. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for perhaps the first time. There were lines etched in his face, stories told in the hardened gaze, that spoke of things she couldn't yet fathom. And she wondered, with a strange mix of fear and longing, what it would take to break through that carefully constructed wall. The weight of the unseen chains, of family, of duty, of this new bargain, pressed down on her, a heavy burden she was only just beginning to understand. Chapter 7. Beneath the Venetian Moon. Raphael surprised her. A trip to Venice, he announced, was necessary. "Business," he said, his expression unreadable. But Livia suspected there was more to it than that. He'd been watching her, noticing the subtle signs of strain, the way she'd started to withdraw into herself, the haunted look that had returned to her eyes. Venice, in the off-season, was a different world. The throngs of tourists were gone, replaced by a quiet melancholy, a sense of timeless beauty that seeped into your soul. The canals were still, reflecting the pale moonlight, the gondolas bobbing gently in the water, like sleeping swans. They stayed in a small, discreet hotel, tucked away on a quiet canal, far from the bustling crowds of St. Mark's Square. The room was elegant, with a balcony overlooking the water, the air filled with the scent of salt and the distant sound of lapping waves. Raphael had arranged for a private gondola ride, a romantic cliché that Livia would have scoffed at a few weeks ago. But now, as they glided through the silent canals, the city unfolding around them like a dream, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The gondolier, a wizened old man with a voice like weathered leather, sang a traditional Venetian love song, his voice echoing across the water. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a longing that resonated deep within Livia's soul. Raphael sat beside her, his arm resting lightly on the back of her seat, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. He didn't speak, simply watching her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to decipher the secrets hidden within her heart. Livia leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the beauty of the city wash over her. She felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. It was a tear of sadness, of loss, but also of something else, a glimmer of hope, a flicker of something that might have been happiness. Raphael gently wiped the tear away with his thumb, his touch surprisingly tender. "Venice does that to you," he murmured, his voice a low whisper. "It brings out the emotions you try to hide." Livia opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "Yes, you are," he said. "But you're getting better at it." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Let go, Livia," he whispered. "Let go of the past. Let go of the fear. Let yourself feel." His words were a seductive invitation, a promise of release, of surrender. Livia felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and desire. She was drawn to him, to his strength, to his darkness, but she was also afraid. afraid of losing herself, of losing control, of surrendering to a man who represented everything she had lost. The gondola glided beneath a bridge, the shadows enveloping them, creating a sense of intimacy, of isolation. Raphael's hand moved to her neck, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw, sending shivers down her spine. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, were filled with a hunger, a desire that mirrored her own. "I see you, Livia," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I see the pain, the fear, the loneliness. But I also see the strength, the resilience, the fire." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a question asked without words. Livia's breath caught in her throat. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by his proximity, by the scent of his cologne, by the warmth of his body. She felt a pull, a yearning, a desire that had been dormant for so long, awakening within her. She wanted to resist, to push him away, but she couldn't. She was drawn to him, to his darkness, to his promise of something more. Something real, something that transcended the carefully constructed that she'd created. She met that first touch with a yearning of her own. It was more than a spark. It was a conflagration, a sudden blaze of everything she had tried to bury. And for a long moment, under the Venetian moon, the world consisted only of him. The future stretched, uncertain, but in this stolen pocket of time, there was only the undeniable truth of their connection. It was a silent admission, a fragile beginning. Chapter 8. Masks and Mirrored Lies. The return to Milan was a jarring contrast to the ethereal beauty of Venice. The weight of their unspoken agreement, the burgeoning feelings that had surfaced beneath the Venetian moon, now hung heavy in the air, complicated by the harsh realities of Raphael's world. Livia found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate web of the famiglia. Raphael, while still guarded, began to include her in meetings, introducing her to key figures within his organization. These were men and women hardened by years of navigating the treacherous currents of the underworld, their faces etched with a mixture of cunning, ruthlessness, and a wary respect for Raphael. She observed them carefully, learning their names, their roles, their allegiances. She saw the subtle power plays, the veiled threats, the constant jockeying for position. It was a world of masks, of carefully constructed personas designed to conceal true intentions. One evening, Raphael hosted a dinner party at the Palazzo Visconti. It was a lavish affair, a display of power and wealth designed to impress and intimidate. The guests were a mix of business associates, politicians, and members of other prominent families. Livia dressed carefully, choosing a gown that was both elegant and striking, a deep emerald green that complemented her dark hair and eyes. She knew she was being watched, assessed, judged. She had to project an image of strength, of confidence, even if she felt like an imposter. As she circulated among the guests, she overheard snippets of conversations, whispers of deals, of alliances, of betrayals. She saw the way they looked at Raphael, with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was the capo, the leader, the man in control. But Livia also noticed the cracks in the facade, the subtle tensions, the underlying rivalries. She saw the way some of the older members of the famiglia looked at her, with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. They remembered her father, and they were not entirely convinced of her loyalty or her competence. She found herself drawn into a conversation with a man named Donatello Rossi, a senior member of a rival family. He was charming, urbane, but his eyes held a cold, calculating glint. "Signorina Marchesi," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "It is a pleasure to see you back in Milan. Your father would have been proud." Livia smiled politely, but her guard was up. "Thank you, Don Rossi," she replied. "It is good to be back." "Your father and I had our disagreements," Don Rossi continued, his gaze lingering on her. "But we always respected each other. He was a man of honor." Livia knew that Don Rossi was testing her, probing for weaknesses. He was trying to gauge her allegiance to see if she could be manipulated. "My father taught me the importance of loyalty," Livia said, her voice firm. And of discretion. Don Rossi chuckled, a low, throaty sound. Indeed, he said. Discretion is a valuable asset in our world. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the opulent surroundings. Raphael has done well for himself, he observed. He has consolidated his power. But power, it is a fickle thing. It can be lost as quickly as it is gained. Livia knew that his words were a veiled threat, a reminder of the precariousness of Raphael's position, and of her own. She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. I am aware of the risks, Don Rossi, she said. But I am not afraid. He smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes.
Perhaps you should be, he said softly.
The conversation left Livia shaken. She realized that she was not only navigating Raphael's world, but also the complex and dangerous relationships between the various families. She was caught in a web of intrigue, of alliances and rivalries that stretched back generations. Later that evening, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, Raphael joined her. He had shed his jacket, his tie loosened, his expression more relaxed than she had seen him all evening. Don Rossi, he said, his voice a low murmur. He was inquiring about you. Livia nodded.
He was testing me, she said, trying to see where my loyalties lie.
Raphael smiled, a cynical expression.
He's a snake, he said.
But a dangerous one. Be careful of him. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. And what did you tell him? He asked, his voice laced with a hint of curiosity. I told him I was loyal, Livia said. And discreet. Raphael chuckled.
Good, he said.
That's what I wanted to hear. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. You're learning, he said, his voice a low whisper. You're becoming one of us. Livia wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a curse. She was adapting, yes, but at what cost? She was learning to wear the masks, to play the games, to navigate the treacherous currents of this world. But she was also losing a part of herself, the innocent, idealistic girl she had once been. The mirrored lies were starting to reflect back at her, and she wondered if she would recognize herself in the end. The weight of that question pressed down on her, a heavy burden in the opulent, dangerous world she now inhabited. Chapter 9. The Lion's Den Revisited. The summons was unexpected, a curt message delivered by one of Raphael's men. Be ready in an hour. We're going to see your father's house. Livia's heart pounded in her chest. Her father's house. The place where she had grown up, the place where her world had shattered. She hadn't been back since the night she fled, 5 years ago. The house was located in the hills overlooking the lawn, a sprawling villa surrounded by lush gardens and towering cypress trees. It was a place of beauty, of tranquility, but it was also a place of shadows, of secrets, of memories that haunted her. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, Livia felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The house looked the same, yet different. It was still grand, imposing, but it also seemed empty, lifeless, a ghost of its former self. Raphael parked the car in front of the main entrance. He didn't speak, simply watching her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to gauge her reaction. Livia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She opened the car door and stepped out, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The front door was unlocked. Raphael pushed it open, revealing a large, marble-floored foyer. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling home she remembered. They walked through the silent rooms, each one a repository of memories. The living room, with its grand piano and ornate fireplace, where she had spent countless hours playing and listening to her father tell stories. The dining room, with its long mahogany table, where they had shared family meals, filled with laughter and conversation. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, where she had lost herself in countless worlds. Each room evoked a wave of emotions, a mixture of nostalgia, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. She felt like a ghost, wandering through the ruins of her past. Raphael remained silent, observing her, his presence a constant, reassuring weight in the oppressive silence. He seemed to understand the emotional toll this visit was taking on her, offering a quiet support that surprised her. They finally reached her father's study, the room that held the most significance, the room that might hold the key to the secrets she was seeking. The door was locked. Raphael produced a key, a small, ornate key that Livia recognized. It was the key to her father's safe. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The study was much as she remembered it. A large, mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface covered with papers and books. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes. And in the corner stood the safe. Livia walked over to the desk, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the wood. She opened a drawer, finding it filled with her father's personal belongings. Pens, notepads, photographs. She picked up a photograph, a picture of her and her father, taken when she was a child. He was smiling, his arm around her, his eyes filled with love. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. She hadn't allowed herself to grieve, not properly. She had been too busy running, too busy surviving. But now, standing in her father's study, surrounded by his belongings, the full weight of her loss hit her. Raphael came up behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. He didn't speak, simply offering his presence, his support. "The safe," he said, his voice a low murmur. Livia nodded, her gaze fixed on the photograph. She put it down, her hand trembling. She walked over to the safe, her heart pounding in her chest. Raphael stepped forward and inserted the key. He turned the dial, the tumblers clicking softly. The door swung open, revealing a small, dark interior. Inside, there were several stacks of documents, bound with leather straps. And on top of the documents lay a small wooden box. Livia reached for the box, her fingers trembling. She opened it, revealing a single, leather-bound book. The ledger. She lifted it out, her hands shaking. It was heavier than she expected, its weight a physical manifestation of the secrets it contained. She felt the sudden gravity of the situation, the potential consequences of what she held. A turning point. She looked up at Raphael. He was watching her. His expression was unreadable, as it always was. But this time, she felt a strong sense that the masks they both wore were cracking, and the path ahead would be decided by what was to come. The lion's den had revealed its treasure, but the true test was yet to begin. Chapter 10. Scars that Whisper Secrets. The ledger was more than just a record of transactions, it was a map of Antonio Marchese's life, a chronicle of his rise to power, his alliances, his betrayals. Livia spent hours poring over its pages, deciphering the coded entries, the names, the dates, the amounts. The entries were written in a combination of Italian, Latin, and a cipher that Livia struggled to understand. Alessandro Bellini, with his knowledge of her father's methods, proved invaluable in helping her decode the more obscure passages. They worked together, often late into the night, in Alessandro's dimly lit apartment, surrounded by books and documents. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the unspoken tension of their shared task. As Livia delved deeper into the ledger, she began to uncover a web of secrets that reached far beyond her father's immediate circle. She discovered names she recognized, prominent figures in Milanese society, politicians, businessmen, even members of the judiciary. She also discovered names she didn't recognize, names that hinted at a network of connections that extended beyond Italy to other countries, other organizations. It was a world far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The ledger also revealed details about her father's downfall, the betrayal that had led to his ruin. It confirmed what Alessandro had suspected. The betrayal had come from within, from someone he had trusted implicitly. The name that appeared most frequently in the final entries was Il Serpent the Serpent. It was a code name, a mask, but Livia knew, with a chilling certainty, that it referred to the person who had orchestrated her father's demise. She also discovered entries that referred to Raphael, entries that made her blood run cold. They suggested that he had been involved in her father's business far earlier and far more deeply than he had ever admitted. One evening, as she sat across from Raphael in his office, she confronted him. She placed the ledger on the desk between them, its pages open to a particularly damning entry. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Why is your name here? What were you doing with my father?" Raphael didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said, his voice calm. "I was your father's enforcer. I did what needed to be done. But this," Livia gestured to the ledger, "this suggests you were more than just an enforcer. You were his partner." Raphael smiled, a cynical expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Partnerships take many forms, Livia," he said. "Some are formal, some are informal. And what was your partnership with my father?" Livia pressed, her voice rising. "Was it informal when you betrayed him?" Raphael's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "I did not betray your father," he said, his voice firm. "I protected him. Until the very end." "Protected him?" Livia scoffed. "By helping Il Serpent destroy him?" Raphael's eyes narrowed. "You know about Il Serpent?" he asked, his voice laced with surprise. "I know enough," Livia replied. "I know that he was responsible for my father's downfall. And I know that you were involved with him." Raphael stood up, walking over to the window, his back to her. He remained silent for a long moment, his shoulders tense. "Il Serpent," he said, his voice low, "is a dangerous enemy, Livia. More dangerous than you can imagine." "And you were his ally?" Livia asked, her voice trembling. Raphael turned to face her, his expression pained. He walked over to her, his hands reaching out to cup her face. "I was young," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I was ambitious. I made mistakes. But I never betrayed your father. I swear to you." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "There are things you don't understand, Livia," he said. "Things I can't explain. Not yet." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. "Trust me," he whispered. "Please." Livia wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the ledger, the evidence, the scars of the past, whispered a different story. The weight of doubt pressed down on her, a heavy burden that threatened to crush her. She looked into his eyes and, for the first time, saw not just power and control, but vulnerability. A vulnerability that mirrored her own, a shared past of pain and secrets. It was a terrifying and strangely compelling revelation. And the question that remained, the one that haunted her, was, whose secrets were deeper and whose scars ran the truest? Chapter 11. The Price of Lost Grace. The revelation of Raphael's past involvement, however murky the details remained, cast a long shadow over their fragile alliance. Livia found herself constantly questioning his motives, his words, his actions. Trust, once a flickering flame, threatened to be extinguished by the winds of suspicion. She continued to work with Alessandro, delving deeper into the ledger, searching for concrete proof of Il Serpent's identity and of Raphael's role in her father's downfall. The more she learned, the more complex and dangerous the situation became. She discovered that Il Serpent was not just a single individual, but a network, a clandestine organization that had infiltrated various levels of Italian society. They were involved in everything from drug trafficking to political corruption, their reach extending far beyond the traditional boundaries of the mafia. And she discovered that Raphael had been deeply entangled with this network, his past a tangled web of alliances and betrayals. He had walked a tightrope, balancing his loyalty to her father with his own ambitions, his own survival. One afternoon, Alessandro called her, his voice urgent. "I've found something," he said. "Something important. Meet me at the Cimitero Monumentale, the Marchesi family tomb." The Cimitero Monumentale was Milan's grand cemetery, a city of the dead, filled with elaborate mausoleums and sculptures, a testament to the city's history and its prominent families. Livia arrived at the Marchesi family tomb, a massive structure of marble and granite, adorned with statues of angels and weeping figures. Alessandro was waiting for her, his face pale, his hands trembling. "What is it?" Livia asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Alessandro handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "I found this hidden inside your father's crypt," he said.
behind one of the plaques.
Livia unfolded the paper, her hands shaking. It was a letter, written in her father's handwriting. It was addressed to her. The letter was short, cryptic, but its message was clear. Her father had known he was in danger. He had suspected betrayal, but he hadn't known from whom. He had written the letter as a precaution, a final message to his daughter. The letter ended with a single, chilling sentence. Trust no one, Livia.
Especially not those closest to you.
Livia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her father's words, written from beyond the grave, confirmed her worst fears. She was surrounded by enemies, by people who wanted to use her, to control her, to destroy her. And Raphael, could she trust him? He had sworn his loyalty, he had risked his life to protect her. But the ledger, the letter, the whispers of the past, all cast a shadow of doubt on his sincerity. She looked up at Alessandro, her eyes filled with tears. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alessandro placed a comforting hand on her shoulder.
"You fight," he said.
"You use the knowledge you have gained. You expose Il Serpent. You reclaim your father's legacy." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But you must be careful, Livia," he added. "You are playing a dangerous game. And your enemies, they are watching." As if to underscore his words, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing figure that Livia recognized instantly. Raphael. He had followed her. He had been watching. He walked towards them, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Livia. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low, his gaze focused on the letter in her hand. Livia hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could she risk revealing her father's final message? She looked from the letter to Alessandro, to the looming figure of Raphael, and the truth settled heavily upon her. She was utterly alone. The price of her lost grace, of her family's legacy, was isolation. And a decision had to be made, in that city of the dead, a decision that would determine her future and perhaps her survival. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the secrets, the danger, pressed down on her, a suffocating burden. Chapter 12. A Dance with Shadows. The confrontation at the Cimitero Monumentale marked a turning point. Livia, armed with her father's warning, made a conscious decision. She wouldn't confront Raphael directly, not yet. She would play his game, wear the mask of cooperation, while secretly continuing her own investigation, her own search for the truth. She handed Raphael the letter, watching his face closely as he read it. His expression remained impassive, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "Your father was a wise man," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He knew the dangers." He handed the letter back to her, his fingers brushing against hers, a fleeting contact that sent a shiver down her spine. "We need to be careful," he said. "We need to work together." Livia nodded, her gaze unwavering.
"Of course," she said.
"We're partners, remember?" The word partners hung in the air, a fragile bridge between them, built on a foundation of lies and unspoken truths. The following days were a delicate dance, a constant interplay of trust and suspicion. Livia continued to work with Raphael, attending meetings, reviewing documents, playing the role of the loyal heiress. But she also continued to work with Alessandro, secretly pursuing her own investigation, her own search for Il Serpent. She learned to compartmentalize, to separate her emotions from her actions, to wear the mask of deception with increasing ease. It was a dangerous game, a constant test of her will, her courage, her ability to survive. Raphael, for his part, seemed to accept her cooperation, her loyalty. He treated her with a mixture of respect and possessiveness, his gaze lingering on her, his touch sending shivers down her spine. But Livia knew that he was watching her, testing her, probing for weaknesses. He was a master manipulator, a man who thrived in the shadows, and she was constantly aware of the danger he represented. One evening, Raphael took her to a private club, a hidden enclave of power and privilege, frequented by the elite of Milanese society. It was a place where deals were made, secrets were shared, and alliances were forged. As they entered the club, Livia felt a sense of unease. She recognized some of the faces, prominent figures in politics, business, and the underworld. They were all players in the game, pieces on the chessboard, and she was just another pawn. Raphael introduced her to several of his associates, men and women who greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and veiled suspicion. They were assessing her, evaluating her, trying to determine her worth. She found herself drawn into a conversation with a woman named Isabella Rossi, the wife of Donatello Rossi, the man who had warned her about Raphael. Isabella was elegant, sophisticated, but her eyes held a cold, calculating glint. "Signorina Marchesi," Isabella said, her voice smooth as silk. "It is a pleasure to see you again. You are adapting well to your new life." Livia smiled politely. "Thank you, Signora Rossi," she replied. "I am learning." "Raphael is a powerful man," Isabella continued, her gaze lingering on Livia. "But power, it can be a dangerous thing. It attracts enemies." Livia knew that Isabella was not simply making conversation. She was sending a message, a warning, or perhaps an offer. "I am aware of the risks, Signora Rossi," Livia said, her voice firm. "But I am not afraid." Isabella smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you should be," she said softly. "Raphael has many secrets. And secrets, they have a way of coming out." The conversation left Livia shaken. She realized that she was not only playing a game with Raphael, but also with the other players in this complex web of power and intrigue. She was surrounded by enemies, and she couldn't trust anyone. Later that evening, as she and Raphael were leaving the club, a fight broke out. It all happened with alarming speed. The words exchanged, the sudden shove. And then men were on Raphael, knives glinting. It was clearly an ambush. Livia reacted without thinking. She grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from a nearby table and smashed it over the head of one of the attackers, sending him sprawling to the floor. Raphael, despite being outnumbered, fought with a ferocity that both terrified and impressed her. He moved with a deadly grace, his fists and feet striking with precision and power. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Raphael's men quickly intervened, subduing the attackers. Livia stood there, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She had acted instinctively, protecting Raphael, protecting herself. She had crossed a line. And in the smoky haze of the aftermath, she saw a flicker of something new in Raphael's eyes. Respect? Admiration? Or something far more dangerous? The shadows had danced, and Livia had danced with them. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the game had just begun. Chapter 13. The Taste of Bitter Almonds. The attempted ambush at the club had shaken Raphael, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He became even more protective of Livia, his presence a constant shadow, his gaze always watchful. He knew that the attack had been orchestrated by Il Serpente, a message, a warning, a reminder of his power. He increased security at the Palazzo Visconti, surrounding himself with his most trusted men. He also began to limit Livia's movements, restricting her access to the outside world. He claimed it was for her safety, but Livia knew it was also a way to control her, to keep her isolated. She found herself increasingly confined to the palazzo, her days filled with a growing sense of unease. She felt like a prisoner, trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but deprived of her freedom. She continued to work with Alessandro, communicating with him through coded messages and clandestine meetings. They were making progress in their investigation, slowly piecing together the puzzle of Il Serpente's identity, but they were also aware that they were running out of time. One evening, Raphael hosted a small, intimate dinner party at the palazzo. It was a gathering of his closest allies, the men he trusted most. Livia was included, of course, but she felt like an outsider, an observer, watching the intricate dance of power and loyalty unfold before her. The dinner was lavish, a display of wealth and opulence designed to impress. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, but the conversation was guarded, filled with veiled threats and unspoken agendas. Livia sat beside Raphael, her presence a symbol of his power, his control. She played the role of the dutiful heiress, smiling politely, engaging in polite conversation, but her mind was racing. She was searching for clues, for any hint of Il Serpent's identity, for any weakness she could exploit. As the evening progressed, she noticed that one of Raphael's men, a man named Marco, was acting strangely. He was nervous, agitated, his eyes constantly darting around the room. He also refused to eat or drink anything, which struck Livia as odd. She discreetly observed him, noticing that he kept touching his pocket, as if checking for something. She suspected that he was carrying a message from Il Serpent. After dinner, as the guests were mingling, Livia managed to corner Marco in a secluded hallway. "Marco," she said, her voice low and firm. "What are you hiding?" Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. "Nothing, Signorina," he stammered. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," Livia said, her gaze unwavering. "I know you're carrying a message. From Il Serpent." Marco's face paled. He looked around, as if searching for an escape. "Please, Signorina," he whispered.
"Don't say that name."
He has eyes everywhere. "Tell me what you know," Livia pressed.
"Tell me who he is."
Marco hesitated, his fear battling with his loyalty. He glanced around one final time before leaning towards Livia and whispering, "The meeting tonight. The old distillery. Midnight."
Then a sudden, sharp gasp.
His eyes widened. He clutched at his chest, his face contorting in pain. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. Livia knelt beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. She checked for pulse, but there was none. He was dead. She looked around, her mind racing. She realized what had happened. The wine. It had been poisoned. But how? And by whom? She noticed a faint, bitter smell emanating from Marco's lips. Bitter almonds. Cyanide. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She had to warn Raphael. But she also knew that she couldn't trust anyone. The poisoner was among them, one of Raphael's trusted allies. She ran back to the dining room, her mind racing. She had to find Raphael, to warn him, but she also had to be careful. She couldn't reveal what she knew, not yet. The killer was watching, waiting, and she had to be one step ahead. The taste of bitter almonds lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger that surrounded them and the deadly game that was being played. The realization of how close death was, and how easily she could have been the target, settled like ice in her veins. Chapter 14. Where Loyalty Ends. The discovery of Marco's death cast a pall over the palazzo. Raphael, enraged and grief-stricken, ordered an immediate lockdown. No one was allowed to leave, and everyone was subjected to questioning. He was determined to find the killer, to avenge the death of his loyal soldier. Livia watched the unfolding chaos with a growing sense of dread. She knew that the killer was among them, one of Raphael's trusted men, and she couldn't trust anyone. She had to be careful, to protect herself, while also trying to uncover the truth. Raphael, consumed by his grief and anger, became increasingly volatile, his moods shifting unpredictably. He interrogated his men relentlessly, his methods brutal, his patience wearing thin. He was a man on the edge, driven by a thirst for revenge. Livia tried to remain calm, to observe, to gather information. She knew that the killer was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal what she knew. She had to be one step ahead, to anticipate their moves, to protect herself. She discreetly contacted Alessandro, informing him of Marco's death and the whispered message about the meeting at the old distillery. Alessandro urged her to be careful, to trust no one, and to get out of the palazzo as soon as possible. But Livia knew that she couldn't leave, not yet. She was too close to the truth, too close to uncovering Il Serpent's identity. She had to see this through, to the bitter end. During the interrogations, Livia noticed that one man, in particular, seemed unusually calm, almost detached. His name was Salvatore, Raphael's second-in-command, a man who had been with him for years, a man he trusted implicitly. Salvatore was intelligent, cunning, and ruthless. He was also ambitious, and Livia had always suspected that he harbored a secret resentment towards Raphael, a desire to take his place. She began to watch Salvatore closely, observing his movements, his interactions with the other men. She noticed subtle clues, small inconsistencies in his behavior that made her increasingly suspicious. She discovered that Salvatore had been alone for a brief period during the dinner party, long enough to have poisoned Marco's wine. She also discovered that he had a history of using cyanide, a preferred method of eliminating his enemies. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to convince Livia that Salvatore was the killer and, most likely, Illinois Serpent. He was the one who had betrayed her father, the one who had orchestrated the attack on Raphael, the one who had poisoned Marco. She knew that she had to tell Raphael, but she also knew that she couldn't simply accuse Salvatore without concrete proof. He was too powerful, too well connected, and Raphael would never believe her. She decided to set a trap, to expose Salvatore in a way that would leave no room for doubt. She knew it was a dangerous gamble, but she had no other choice. She arranged a meeting with Raphael in his office late at night. She told him that she had information about Marco's death, information that could lead them to the killer. Raphael, exhausted and desperate, agreed to meet her. He was still blinded by grief and anger, but there was also a flicker of hope, of a desire to trust. The meeting, however, was interrupted. Livia had returned to her room to get a document, a ledger entry linking Salvatore to a known associate of Il Serpent. When she came back, she found Raphael standing over Salvatore's lifeless body. Salvatore, throat slit, bled onto the expensive Persian rug. Raphael's hands and knife were covered in blood. He confessed, Raphael said, his voice hoarse and raw. He was Il Serpent. He killed Marco. He tried to kill me. Livia stared at the scene, her mind reeling. Was it true? Had Salvatore confessed? Or had Raphael silenced him before he could reveal the truth? She was back where she'd started, unable to trust anyone, unsure of everything. Loyalty had ended, and she was alone, surrounded by enemies, in a palace of blood and lies. The weight of the situation, the constant betrayal, pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. Where did it end? Chapter 15. The Unveiling of Faded Glory. The death of Salvatore, while seemingly resolving the immediate threat, did little to ease Livia's unease. Raphael's explanation, his claim that Salvatore had confessed, felt hollow, incomplete. There were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being manipulated, that Raphael was hiding something, that the truth was still out there, lurking in the shadows. She decided to take matters into her own hands, to conduct her own investigation, independent of Raphael and Alessandro. She needed to find concrete proof, undeniable evidence that would expose the true identity of Il Serpent and reveal the full extent of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. She started by revisiting her father's house, the place where it had all begun. She spent hours searching through the rooms, examining every object, every document, every hidden corner. She was looking for something, anything, that might shed light on the truth. She focused on her father's study, the room that held the most secrets, the room that might hold the key to unlocking the past. She meticulously examined the desk, the bookshelves, the safe, searching for any hidden compartments, any secret messages. She discovered a small, almost invisible crack in the back panel of the safe. She carefully pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, she found a single, small, antique key. The key was unfamiliar, but Livia knew instantly that it was important. It was old, ornate, and it felt heavy in her hand, as if it held the weight of 1,000 secrets. She remembered a conversation she'd had with her father, years ago, about a family heirloom, a small, secluded villa on Lake Como, a place where he had gone to escape the pressures of his business, a place where he had kept his most private possessions. She realized that the key must belong to that villa. It was a place where her father had hidden something, something he wanted to protect, something that might hold the key to uncovering the truth. She decided to go to Lake Como, to visit the villa, to see what secrets it held. She knew it was a risk, that she might be walking into a trap, but she had no other choice. She had to find the truth, no matter the cost. She left the Palazzo Visconti in the dead of night, without telling Raphael or Alessandro. She drove alone, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with anticipation and fear. The villa was located on a secluded stretch of the lake, hidden amidst lush gardens and towering cypress trees. It was a place of beauty, of tranquility, but it also felt isolated, haunted, a place where secrets had been kept for generations. She used the key to unlock the front door, stepping inside the silent, darkened villa. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling life she remembered from her childhood visits. She explored the rooms, her footsteps echoing through the silence. The villa was furnished in an old-fashioned style, with antique furniture, faded paintings, and a lingering sense of a bygone era. She finally reached a small, unassuming study, tucked away at the back of the villa. She knew, instinctively, that this was where her father had hidden his secrets. She searched the room, examining every object, every surface, searching for any hidden compartments, any clues. She discovered a small, antique writing desk, its surface covered with a layer of dust. She opened the drawers, finding them filled with old letters, documents, and photographs. She began to examine the contents of the drawers, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found letters from her father to various associates, business partners, and even government officials. She found documents detailing financial transactions, property deals, and political contributions. And then, she found it. A small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with her father's handwriting. She opened the diary, her hands trembling. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding in her chest. The diary revealed a shocking truth, a truth that shattered everything she had believed about her father, about Raphael, about the world she inhabited. Her father had not been betrayed by Salvatore. He had been betrayed by someone far closer, someone he had trusted implicitly, someone he had loved. He had been betrayed by Alessandro Bellini. The faded glory of the villa, the beauty of Lake Como, all seemed to mock her. The truth, so long sought, was a devastating blow, a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. The weight of it all, the lies, the deception, the manipulation, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. She finally had the answers, but they weren't what she'd been expecting at all. Chapter 16. A Requiem for Broken Vows. The revelation that Alessandro Bellini, her father's trusted confidant, her supposed ally, was Il Serpente, hit Livia like a physical blow. It was a betrayal that shattered her world, leaving her reeling in a vortex of disbelief and despair. She read and reread her father's diary, the words blurring through her tears. The diary detailed Alessandro's long-standing resentment towards her father, his jealousy of his power and success, his desire to take control of the Marchesi Empire. It also revealed Alessandro's meticulous planning, his manipulation of events, his orchestration of her father's downfall. He had used his position of trust to gather information, to plant false evidence, to turn her father's allies against him. And he had used Livia, manipulating her, guiding her, using her quest for justice to further his own agenda. He had played her like a pawn, exploiting her grief, her loyalty, her desire for revenge. The diary also revealed the truth about Raphael. He had not been involved in her father's downfall. He had been trying to protect him, to uncover the conspiracy, but he had been too late. He had been framed by Alessandro, set up to take the fall for his crimes. Livia felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had misjudged Raphael. She had doubted him. She had accused him of betraying her father. She had been blinded by her grief, by her desire for revenge, and she had played right into Alessandro's hands. She closed the diary, her hands trembling. She had to confront Alessandro, to expose him, to make him pay for his crimes. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed Raphael. She left the villa, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She drove back to Milan, her thoughts consumed by a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a growing sense of determination. She arrived at the Palazzo Visconti in the early hours of the morning. The palazzo was silent, shrouded in darkness. She found Raphael in his office, sitting alone, staring out the window. He turned as she entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Livia," he said, his voice soft. "Where have you been?"
"I've been worried about you."
Livia walked over to him, her gaze unwavering. She held out the diary, her hand trembling. "Read this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's my father's diary. It reveals the truth. About everything." Raphael took the diary, his expression questioning. He began to read, his eyes scanning the pages, his face slowly turning pale. As he read, his expression changed from disbelief to anger, to a cold, hard fury that Livia had never seen before. He finished reading, his hands clenched into fists, his body trembling with rage. "Alessandro," he said, his voice a low growl. "He was Il Serpent. All along." Livia nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "He used us," she said. "He manipulated us. He destroyed my father. And he tried to destroy you." Raphael looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and a fierce, protective love. "I'm sorry, Livia," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." Livia shook her head. "It's not your fault," she said. "He fooled us all." Raphael stood up, his body radiating a dangerous energy. "He will pay for this," he said, his voice filled with a cold, deadly determination. "I swear to you, he will pay." Livia knew that Raphael meant what he said. He was a man of his word, a man of action, and he would not rest until Alessandro had been brought to justice. She looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She had misjudged him, she had doubted him, but now she saw him for who he truly was. A man of honor, a man of loyalty, a man who would protect her, no matter the cost. A requiem for broken vows was playing, but for the first time in a long time, Livia felt a flicker of hope, a sense of a shared purpose, a bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss. The path ahead was still dangerous, but she was no longer alone. Chapter 17. The Serpent's Embrace. The confrontation with Alessandro was inevitable, a clash of wills and a reckoning for past sins. Raphael, fueled by a righteous fury and a desire to protect Livia, orchestrated the meeting with a cold precision. He chose a neutral location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Milan, a place where secrets could be revealed and justice could be served. He sent a message to Alessandro, a summons, a challenge, a promise of retribution. Livia insisted on being present, despite Raphael's concerns for her safety. She needed to face Alessandro, to confront him with her father's diary, to witness his downfall. They arrived at the warehouse, Raphael's men securing the perimeter, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the unspoken threat of violence. Alessandro arrived shortly after, accompanied by two of his own men. He looked older, more frail than Livia remembered, but his eyes still held that cold, calculating glint, the mark of Il Serpent. He greeted Livia with a feigned warmth, a mask of concern that quickly crumbled under the weight of her accusations. "Livia, Cara," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "What is the meaning of this? Why have you brought me here?" Livia stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, her voice filled with a cold, hard fury. "You know why, Alessandro," she said. "You betrayed my father. You destroyed my family. You are Il Serpent." Alessandro's smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock, of disbelief, quickly followed by a cold, hard mask of denial. "You are mistaken, Livia," he said, his voice firm. "I was your father's friend, his confidant. I would never betray him." Livia held out her father's diary, her hand trembling. "This is my father's diary," she said. "He wrote everything.
He knew about you.
He knew about your betrayal." Alessandro's eyes flickered to the diary, his expression unreadable. He took a step back, his hand moving towards his jacket, towards the gun that Livia knew he carried. Raphael stepped forward, his hand on his own weapon, his gaze fixed on Alessandro. "Don't even think about it," Raphael said, his voice a low growl. "It's over, Alessandro. You're finished." Alessandro looked from Livia to Raphael, his face contorting in a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think you can defeat me?" he sneered. "You think you can stop me? I have allies, connections, power that you can't even imagine." "Your power is an illusion, Alessandro," Livia said, her voice cold. "It's built on lies, on betrayal, on the blood of innocent people." Alessandro laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed through the warehouse. "You are naive, Livia," he said. "You don't understand how the world works. Power is everything. And I will do whatever it takes to protect mine." He lunged for his gun, his movements surprisingly quick for a man his age. But Raphael was faster. He drew his own weapon, firing a single shot that struck Alessandro in the chest. Alessandro staggered backward, his eyes widening in shock, his hand clutching at the wound. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing, his lifeblood staining the concrete. Livia watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind numb with disbelief. It was over. Aiel Serpent was dead. The man who had destroyed her family, the man who had manipulated her, had finally been brought to justice. Raphael's men moved quickly, securing the scene, disarming Alessandro's men. Raphael walked over to Livia, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Livia nodded, her eyes fixed on Alessandro's lifeless body. She felt a strange mixture of emotions, of relief, of sadness, of a profound sense of emptiness. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Raphael put his arm around her, his touch a comforting warmth in the cold, desolate warehouse. "It's over," he repeated, his voice firm. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Livia knew that it wasn't truly over. The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, would take time to heal. The serpent's embrace had left its mark, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their world. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sirens. The reckoning had come, but the cost was etched on both their faces. Chapter 18. Blood on the Cobblestones. Despite Alessandro's death, a sense of unease lingered. Raphael, while relieved to have eliminated a direct threat, knew that Aiel Serpent's network was vast, its tendrils reaching deep into the fabric of Milanese society. He couldn't be certain that all of Alessandro's allies had been neutralized. He tightened security around Livia, insisting that she remain at the Palazzo Visconti, under the constant protection of his men. He was taking no chances, his protective instincts heightened by the recent events. Livia, while grateful for Raphael's protection, felt stifled, confined. She needed to be involved, to be proactive, to help dismantle the remnants of Aiel Serpent's organization. She couldn't simply sit idly by, waiting for the next threat to emerge. She began to work with Raphael, reviewing documents, analyzing information, trying to identify Alessandro's remaining allies, to uncover their plans, to anticipate their next move. She was determined to use her knowledge, her skills, her connection to her father's legacy, to help bring them to justice. One evening, while reviewing financial records, Livia discovered a series of suspicious transactions, large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts, linked to a company she didn't recognize. She investigated further, tracing the company's ownership, discovering that it was a shell corporation controlled by a prominent Milanese businessman, a man named Giovanni Conti. Conti was a respected figure in the community, a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, a man who seemed above suspicion. But Livia knew that appearances could be deceiving. She presented her findings to Raphael, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "I think I've found something," she said. A connection between Alessandro and Giovanni Conti. A series of suspicious transactions, large sums of money being moved offshore. Raphael studied the documents, his expression grim. He knew Conti. He had met him on several occasions. He had even considered him a potential ally. "Connie," he said, his voice low. "I never would have suspected him." "He's been careful," Livia said. "He's covered his tracks well. But I think he's one of Il Serpent's key players. Perhaps even his successor." Raphael nodded, his mind racing. He knew that they had to act quickly, to confront Connie, to expose him, to bring him to justice. He decided to pay Connie a visit, to confront him with the evidence, to force him to reveal his involvement with Il Serpent. He insisted that Livia remain at the palazzo, for her safety, but she refused. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm. "I need to see this through. I need to face him." Raphael hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his respect for Livia's determination. He knew that she was right, that she deserved to be there, to witness Connie's downfall. They drove to Connie's office, a sleek, modern building in the heart of Milan's financial district. Raphael's men secured the perimeter, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. They confronted Conti in his office, a lavishly appointed space with panoramic views of the city. Conti greeted them with a feigned politeness, a mask of innocence that quickly crumbled under the weight of Livia's accusations. "Signor Costa, Signorina Marchesi," he said, "what a pleasant surprise. What brings you here?" "We're here about the money," Connie said, his voice hard. Livia added, "The money you've been laundering for Il Serpent, Connie. We have proof." Conti's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Suddenly, all the lights in the office went out. Gunfire erupted. It was a coordinated ambush. Raphael pushed Livia behind a large desk, shielding her with his body. He returned fire, his movements quick and precise, a deadly dance of survival. The office was filled with the sounds of gunfire, of shattering glass, of shouts and screams. Livia huddled behind the desk, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind numb with fear. The firefight was short, brutal, and decisive. Raphael and his men, despite being outnumbered, quickly gained the upper hand. Conti and his men were killed, their bodies sprawled on the floor, their blood staining the cobblestones outside, when some of them had tried to flee. Livia emerged from behind the desk, her legs trembling, her body shaking. She looked at the carnage, at the bodies, at the blood, and felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Raphael walked over to her, his face covered in soot and blood, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Livia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She was shaken, traumatized, by the violence, by the bloodshed, by the realization that she was living in a world where life was cheap and death was always just a heartbeat away. Blood on the cobblestones, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of their world. The victory felt hollow, the cost too high. The shadows had deepened, and Livia wondered if the light would ever truly return. Chapter 19. Redemption in the Ruins. The aftermath of the shootout at Connie's office left Livia deeply shaken. The violence, the bloodshed, the constant threat of death had taken its toll. She found herself retreating inward, haunted by nightmares, struggling to reconcile the woman she had become with the girl she once was. Raphael, sensing her distress, tried to comfort her, to reassure her, to offer her his unwavering support. He understood the darkness she was facing. He had lived in it for most of his life, and he knew that the only way to survive was to find something to hold on to, something to believe in. He took her back to Venice, to the place where they had first shared a moment of genuine connection, a flicker of hope amidst the shadows. He hoped that the beauty of the city, the tranquility of the canals, the memories of their time together, would help her heal, would help her find her way back to the light. They stayed in the same small, discreet hotel, in the same room with the balcony overlooking the water. But this time, there was no pretense, no masks, no hidden agendas. There was only a shared vulnerability, a shared pain, a shared need for connection. They spent their days walking along the canals, exploring the hidden corners of the city, losing themselves in the timeless beauty of Venice. They talked, not about the mafia, Not about Il Serpent, not about the violence and betrayal, but about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their regrets. Livia began to open up to Raphael, sharing her childhood memories, her love for her father, her grief over his loss, her struggle to reconcile her past with her present. Raphael, in turn, revealed his own vulnerabilities, his own regrets, his own longing for a different life, a life free from the darkness that had consumed him. He told her about his childhood, his upbringing in the streets of Naples, his recruitment into the mafia, his rise through the ranks, his unwavering loyalty to her father, his struggle to balance his duty with his conscience. He confessed his mistakes, his regrets, his moments of weakness, his moments of doubt. He revealed the scars that marked his soul, the wounds that had never fully healed. As they shared their stories, their vulnerabilities, their hopes, their fears, a new bond began to form between them, a bond built not on power or control, but on trust, on understanding, on a shared desire for redemption. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the canal, the moon casting a silvery glow on the water, Raphael took Livia's hand, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "Livia," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with emotion. "I know I can't change the past. I know I can't erase the pain, the loss, the betrayal. But I can offer you a future free from the shadows, a future filled with hope, with love, with happiness." Livia looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She saw in his eyes not the ruthless enforcer, not the capo, but a man, a vulnerable, wounded man, who was reaching out to her, offering her his heart, his soul, his unwavering love. I don't know if I deserve it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Raphael smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face from one of hardened resolve to one of profound tenderness. "You deserve everything, Livia," he said. "You deserve the world. And I want to give it to you." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a question asked without words. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, no doubt. Livia met his kiss, her heart overflowing with a love that she had never thought possible, a love that had blossomed in the ruins of her past, a love that offered her a chance for redemption, for a new beginning. The ruins of her old life, the shattered remnants of her family's empire, were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had found something stronger, something more enduring, something that would help her rebuild, to heal, to create a new future, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a life beyond the shadows. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And in that reality, there was a profound, enduring beauty. The redemption they both sought was found, not in the past, but in each other. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Returning to Milan, Livia and Raphael were no longer simply allies, bound by a shared enemy and a thirst for revenge. They were partners, in every sense of the word, their love a beacon in the darkness, a source of strength and resilience. But they knew that their newfound peace was fragile, that the remnants of Il Serpent's network still posed a threat. They had eliminated key figures, but the organization was like a hydra, its tentacles reaching deep into the fabric of Italian society. They decided to take a proactive approach, to dismantle the organization from the top down, to expose its corruption, to bring its remaining members to justice. They worked together, combining their skills, their knowledge, their resources, to gather evidence, to identify targets, to plan their final assault. Livia, drawing on her father's legacy, her knowledge of the underworld, her connections to the past, proved to be an invaluable asset. She was no longer the frightened, vulnerable heiress who had fled Milan 5 years ago. She was a strong, confident woman, determined to reclaim her birthright, to avenge her father, to build a new future for herself and for Raphael. Raphael, guided by Livia's insights, her intuition, her unwavering sense of justice, began to operate in a new way. He was still ruthless, still formidable, but he was also more strategic, more calculated, more focused on dismantling the structures of power that had allowed Il Serpent to flourish. They discovered that the true power behind Il Serpent was not a single individual, but a council, a group of prominent figures from various sectors of society, business, politics, law enforcement, who had been secretly collaborating for years, using their influence and resources to control the flow of money, power, and information. The final confrontation took place at a clandestine meeting of the council, held in a secluded villa outside Milan. Raphael, with Livia by his side, led a coordinated assault, his men storming the villa, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. The council members, caught by surprise, were quickly overwhelmed. Some resisted, some tried to flee, but they were all captured, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. The evidence that Livia and Raphael had gathered was overwhelming, undeniable. The council members were arrested, charged with a litany of crimes, from corruption and money laundering to murder and conspiracy. The ensuing trials were a media sensation, exposing the deep-rooted corruption that had plagued Italian society for decades. The public outcry was immense, demanding justice, demanding accountability, demanding an end to the reign of terror that had gripped the nation. Livia, testifying before the court, revealed the full extent of Il Serpent's crimes, her voice strong, her gaze unwavering, her testimony a powerful indictment of the system that had allowed such corruption to flourish. Raphael, while not directly involved in the trials, played a crucial role behind the scenes, providing information, protecting witnesses, ensuring that justice was served. In the end, the council members were convicted, their sentences severe, their reputations ruined, their power shattered. Il Serpent was finally dismantled, its tentacles severed, its influence eradicated. But the final confrontation was not just about defeating the organization. It was about confronting their own hearts, their own loyalties, their own pasts. Livia had to confront the legacy of her father, the darkness that had surrounded him, the choices he had made. She had to come to terms with the fact that he was not the perfect man she had idolized, that he had been complicit in the very system she was now fighting to dismantle. Raphael had to confront his own past, his own involvement in the mafia, his own moments of weakness, his own acts of violence. He had to reconcile his desire for redemption with the scars that marked his soul. They both had to choose, ultimately, between the loyalty to their past and the loyalty to the people they loved. And they chose each other. They chose love, they chose justice, they chose a future free from the shadows, a future built on trust, on understanding, on a shared commitment to building a better world. The confrontation was over. The hearts were healed. The loyalties redefined. And a new chapter began, not in the darkness, but in the light. They finally had a true chance. Epilogue. 5 years later. The Tuscan sun warmed Livia's skin as she stood on the terrace of their villa, overlooking the rolling hills, the vineyards stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a far cry from the rain-slicked streets of Milan, from the shadows of the Palazzo Visconti, from the world of blood and betrayal that had once defined her life. She was no longer Livia Marchesi, the fallen heiress. She was Livia Costa, a woman who had found peace, who had found love, who had found a new purpose in life. Raphael joined her on the terrace, his arms slipping around her waist, his touch still sending a shiver of warmth through her. He had changed, too. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a gentle warmth, a profound contentment. He was still a formidable man, but he had found a new balance, a new way of being. He had left the mafia, severing all ties to his past, dedicating his life to building a new future, a future with Livia, a future free from violence, from darkness, from the constant threat of death. They had used their combined wealth, their knowledge, their connections, to create a foundation dedicated to helping victims of organized crime, to supporting communities ravaged by violence, to promoting education and opportunity as a way to break the cycle of poverty and despair. They had built a new life, a life filled with purpose, with meaning, with a love that had blossomed in the ruins of their past, a love that had endured, that had grown stronger with each passing year. A small, dark-haired girl, her eyes the same shade of deep brown as Raphael's, ran onto the terrace, her laughter echoing through the air.
Mama, Papa,
She cried, her arms outstretched. Livia and Raphael knelt down, embracing their daughter, their hearts overflowing with a love that was beyond words. Her name was Isabella, a tribute to a complicated woman who had, ultimately, played an unexpected part in their journey. But this Isabella was a symbol of pure joy, a reminder that something beautiful could rise. Isabella, their daughter, a symbol of their new life, a testament to their resilience, a living embodiment of their love. They had built a family, a sanctuary, a place of peace and happiness, far from the shadows of their past. They had found redemption, not in the ruins of their old lives, but in each other, in their love, in their shared commitment to building a better future. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan landscape, Livia looked at Raphael, at their daughter, at the life they had created together, and she knew that she had finally found her place in the world, her true home, her everlasting love. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs. And it was filled with a quiet, enduring joy, a peace that transcended the darkness, a love that had conquered all. The scars remained, a reminder of the past, but they were no longer a source of pain, but a testament to their SD.